The rules for quotation marks are pretty standard. Unlike the apostrophe, there's no debate about the use of quotation marks. The number one rule about quotation marks is that they always come in pairs. One quotation mark opens a quotation and the second one closes the quotation. Note that in proper English, the noun is quotation and quotation marks. Quote and quotes are verb forms. So don't use quote as a noun when you mean quotation, and don't use quotes as a noun when you mean quotation marks. Proper English uses the word quotation and quotation marks when you're talking about the noun. So we have four uses for quotation marks. The first usage is for direct quotations when we are reporting the exact words that someone said. The second is for certain types of titles. The third is when we have an emphasis on specific words. And also we use quotation marks with other marks of punctuation. So what are some of the rules for direct quotations? Well, first, we use the double quotation marks to both open and close the direct quotation of material that is borrowed from another source. So in current word processing software, the quotation marks are usually smart quotation marks in that the opening quotation marks will automatically point to the right, and the closing quotation marks will automatically curve or point to the left. The other thing is when we're quoting a complete sentence, then we capitalize the first letter of the first word of the quotation. And this is also true if we're writing dialogue. We're recording a complete sentence. If, however, we're quoting something that is part of a sentence and that's embedded in our own writing, then we do not start the quotation with a capital letter. Also, be careful when you are quoting something that you use the exact words that are in the material that you're quoting from. So an example, Neil Armstrong actually said, comma, open quotation mark, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, close quotations. Although he intended to say, open quotation, one small step for a man, close quotation. So you see here that we have two examples, what I just was talking about. In the first one, we have a complete sentence. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. So that quotation starts with a capital letter, and the entire text is enclosed in a pair of quotation marks. But then we have part of a quotation that is embedded in my sentence, although he intended to say one small step for a man. One small step for a man is not a complete sentence. It's embedded in my sentence. It's still a quotation, so it's a pair of quotation marks, but notice the word one is not capitalized. There are a couple of exceptions to the rule about using double quotation marks to enclose quotations. We should use single quotation marks to enclose a quotation within a quotation. So, for example, Ben Franklin said, quote, "The noblest question in the world is," and now we have a second quotation within the first, so we use a single quotation mark, "what good may I do in it?" It's a question, so we have a question mark, then we have the single quotation mark closing the second quotation, and then the double quotation marks closing the first quotation. The other thing to consider is that we should not use quotation marks around borrowings of more than 4 lines of prose or poetry. Instead, we would use a block quotation by indenting the quoted material 10 spaces from the left margin. So here we have an example. I'm writing a paper. In Moll Flanders, Defoe maintains the pseudo-autobiographical narration typical of the picaresque tradition. And then I have a colon, and then the material following is a direct quotation from the novel Moll Flanders. So the first part is my material, and then the block quotation indented shows that I am using direct material from a outside source, and it's not in quotation marks because it's more than 4 lines. All right, now let's look at a special usage of quotation marks, and that is when we're doing creative writing and we need to write dialogue in our creative writing. We use the quotation marks to indicate dialogue. So generally, when we are writing a passage with several speakers, we start a new paragraph each time the speaker changes, and make sure that when you use the introductory or concluding sections of the dialogue that's outside the dialogue, like he said and she replied, that they're all set with commas. So let's look at a couple of examples. Kitty has no discretions in her coughs, comma, said her father. Now notice what we have here. We have direct dialogue. We open it with a quotation mark, we close it with a quotation mark, and we set it off from said her father with a comma. And remember, the comma always goes inside the quotation marks, as does a period. So in the next sentence, you see a continuation of the dialogue, quote, "She times them ill," period. And here we don't need to repeat the her father said or she said, whatever, because we know, we understand it's all in one paragraph, so it's the same speaker speaking. Kitty has no discretion in her coughs. She times them ill. Her father said both of those. In the next paragraph, we have a different speaker. So we start a new paragraph. "I do not cough for my own amusement," Kitty replied fretfully. So we have the same rules here. Open the quotation with a quotation mark, close it with a quotation mark, offset the "Kitty replied fretfully" with a comma, and as I said, make a new paragraph because this is Kitty speaking instead of her father. And this quotation comes from Jane Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice. Continuing our rules for creative writing, writing dialogue, there is another rule that we need to learn. When the same speaker continues for a second paragraph, then we want to omit the closing quotation marks and the end of the first paragraph. So, example here. "The lawyer arranged the papers on her desk," period. Quote, "Here's what I propose we do." We start a new paragraph because the authors just decided that a new paragraph needs to be. But the dialogue is continuing. The lawyer is still talking, so we do not put closing quotation marks. We start a new paragraph. However, we do indicate that the quotation is a continuation by repeating the opening quotation marks. So first we contact the opposite party, then we see where we stand, and then we have closing quotation marks to indicate that the quotation has finished. So this is a special rule, and again, this is only something that you need to worry about if you're doing creative writing in which you are punctuating dialogue. All right, we've looked at the rules for using quotation marks for direct quotations. So now let's look at another use of the quotation mark, and that is to indicate titles. As a general rule, we should use quotation marks to identify the title of short works, such as newspaper, magazine, and journal articles, essays, short stories, poems, songs, TV episodes, but not the name of the TV show, unpublished speeches, chapters of books. The titles of longer works should appear in italics or underlined if we're writing by hand. So, some examples. The theme song of the television show CSI New York is, quote, Baba O'Reilly, close quote, by The Who, not, quote, Teenage Wasteland, close quote, as the song is often erroneously labeled. So notice the TV show CSI New York is italicized because it's a longer work, but the song is Baba O'Reilly and it is put into quotation marks. Another example, the 100th episode of CSI New York, which aired on November 19, 2008, was titled My Name is Mac Taylor, close quote, and was written by Pam Vesey. So this time you see the television show is italicized, but the name of the episode, which is short, it's just one episode, is put into quotation marks. And then as a final example, we have a poem. Poe's poem, The Raven, first appeared in the American Review in February 1845. The American Review is the name of the magazine, and therefore it's italicized, but the poem itself is short, so it's put into quotation marks. A final use of the quotation mark is used to indicate a special sense or emphasis on specific words or phrases or expressions. So, first rule, use the quotation mark to call attention to an unusual word or phrase, a technical term, or a slang or dialectical expression. For example, many people incorrectly spell the words all right and a lot as single words all right and a lot. In this case, we're calling attention to the fact that we have that we're looking at words specifically. We're emphasizing specific words, so we put them in quotation marks. A second use of the quotation mark is to show when we are using words or expressions ironically, sarcastically, or derisively. So, for example, the clerk at the desk directed the tourists to their suites. Bare rooms crowded with cuts. A bathroom down the hall would serve as the spa. So notice how I emphasize those words in speaking, obviously indicating to the listener that I meant those sarcastically because the rooms are hardly a suite and the bathroom down the hall is hardly a spa. How we indicate that in writing is by putting those words around quotation marks. And often you'll see people when they're speaking use the air quotation marks to indicate the same thing, that these are not meant to be taken literally, that we're using some kind of irony or sarcasm here when we're writing these sentences. So that's another use of the quotation mark. What I wanted to caution you however, is don't overdo the use of quotation marks for adding emphasis. Highlighting cliches in this way just makes them more tedious. We know already that they're cliches, so use the quotation mark for emphasis sparingly. One final point I'd like to make about quotation marks is the use of quotation marks with other marks of punctuation. As I hope I've drilled into your head by now, always place a period and a comma inside the quotation marks when you have a need for that period or comma. You put it always inside the quotation mark. Always. Likewise, when you have a colon or a semicolon, always place the colon or the semicolon on the outside of the quotation marks. So those two rules are easy to remember. The only difficulty comes with the question mark and with the exclamation mark. When the quoted material is a question or an exclamation, then put the question mark or the exclamation inside the quotation, the closing quotation mark. If, however, the quotation is part of a larger sentence, and the larger sentence itself is a question or a exclamation, then put the question mark or the exclamation outside of the quotation marks. That's really the only tricky thing to remember when it comes to quotation marks and other marks of punctuation.